used to spend my winters testing my limits against the raw elements of the solo wilderness. This specific trip was meant to be a routine survival exercise in the frozen woods. I had been trekking for hours through the biting cold without seeing a single sign of life. Eventually, the trees began to thin out, revealing a steep valley that looked like a perfect shortcut. I didn't want to waste time circling around, so I decided to descend into the ravine. The walls of the ravine rose up quickly on either side, trapping the cold in the darkness. A strange chill that had nothing to do with the temperature began to creep into my bones. That was when I saw him standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail. He was holding a rifle at the ready like a statue waiting for its prey. His clothes were a filthy mess of mismatched layers that barely clung to his gaunt frame. Those sunken dark eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach twist. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. I felt my shotgun slipping from my shoulder and realized any sudden move could be fatal. I slowly adjusted the strap, making sure my movements were deliberate and non-threatening. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me as the silence between us stretched out. My mouth was so dry I couldn't have spoken even if I wanted to. I forced myself to take a single step backward, never breaking eye contact with the man. The crunch of my boots in the frost sounded like a gunshot in the absolute quiet. I knew that running would only trigger his instinct to shoot, so I kept my pace slow. Even when the trail curved and he vanished from sight, I could still feel his gaze on my back. When I finally emerged from the valley, the oppressive weight of the air seemed to lift. I didn't stop moving until I was miles away from that cursed shortcut. Sitting by my fire that night, I realized nothing about that man made any sense. Hunting season was closed, and that rifle was illegal for anything in these woods. He didn't look like a hunter. He looked like someone who had been replaced by something else entirely. The next morning, I reported the encounter to the local sheriff's office. He just nodded and said they would check it out, but I never heard another word. I have never set foot back in that valley, and I have no intention of ever doing so. Whoever was down there wasn't hunting deer, and they certainly didn't want company. Some secrets in the winter woods are better left buried under the ice. I keep thinking about how many other people might have stumbled into that valley. There was a specific way he was waiting, as if he knew someone would eventually come through. If I had slipped or if my gun had fallen, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Solo survival is about being prepared for the environment, but you can never prepare for other people. The silence of the woods is usually peaceful, but that day was a warning. I still see those dark, sunken eyes every time I close my eyes in a quiet room. There are places in the world that don't belong to us anymore. The man in the valley is a reminder that we are never truly alone, even in the deep freeze. I'm happy to stay out of his way for as long as I live. Nature is harsh, but humanity can be far more terrifying when it loses its way. The memory of the gaunt watcher in the ravine eventually faded into the rhythmic crunch of fresh snow beneath my boots. I had driven an hour down isolated Forest Service roads just to reach the trailhead of this forgotten valley. My goal was simple: 6 miles of hiking to find the kind of silence only the deep winter can provide. There were no footprints in the snow, no signs of life, just the pristine white canvas of the Pennsylvania wild. The trail soon dissolved into a rocky creek bed, forcing me to navigate slippery stones and hidden ice patches. Hours of maneuvering through the brush left me exhausted, but the beauty of the isolation was undeniable. Near a fork in the creek, I spotted a flat stretch of land that looked ideal for setting up my shelter. As I crossed the water, I noticed the first signs that I wasn't the only one who had found this spot. A blue tarp lay spread across the frozen dirt right next to a ring of blackened stones. A thick log nearby had been chopped so cleanly that it looked like it was done with a professional-grade saw. A pile of abandoned gear sat in the shadows, including food wrappers and a small cooking set. It looked as if someone had simply vanished in the middle of their trip, leaving everything behind. By the creek, I found a pile of damp clothes that had been soaked by a rainstorm days earlier. A towel draped over a branch was still heavy with moisture, clinging to the wood like a shroud. Further back, the ground was littered with mounds of toilet paper, suggesting someone had stayed here for weeks. Then, hidden behind a cluster of pines, I saw the object that truly chilled my blood. It was a metal structure, a crude cube of welded bars about 4 feet wide. The cage had no door or hatch. It was a solid, inescapable box of iron. Why anyone would drag a heavy welded cage 6 miles into the wilderness was beyond my comprehension. With the sun gone, I realized I was trapped between an unknown horror and a dangerous hike in the dark. I made the gut-wrenching decision to stay, setting up my tent just yards away from the cage. I kept my hunting knife unsheathed, the cold steel a small comfort against the growing dread. Every snap of a twig in the distance sounded like a heavy footfall approaching my position. I felt eyes on me, watching from the impenetrable blackness beyond my campfire. The night stretched into an eternity of silence and sudden jarring noises. I heard something heavy moving through the snow, far away but steady. The fire died down to glowing embers, casting long, skeletal shadows across the metal cage. When the first light of dawn finally touched the treetops, I didn't wait to make breakfast. I tore down my camp in record time, my hands shaking as I buckled my pack. I gave the metal cage one final look, its cold, silent presence a riddle I never wanted to solve. The hike back felt twice as long, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need for civilization. Reaching my truck felt like escaping a prison, the hum of the engine the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I immediately called the Forest Service and sent them the photos of the cage in the camp. The ranger dismissed it as likely the work of a loner or the remnants of a failed moonshine operation. But his logical explanations couldn't erase the feeling of the cage's cold welded bars from my mind. Some things in the woods are better left unexplained, hidden beneath the winter frost. I never went back to that valley, and I don't plan to ever step foot in those deep woods again. The wilderness is a place of peace, but it is also a place where humanity's darkness can fester in secret. Just as I thought I had found safety in the memory of that trip, a new sound began to echo through my thoughts. It wasn't the sound of a cage being welded, but a scream that tore through the mountain air like a jagged knife. The echo of that jagged scream had barely faded before the heavy, oppressive silence of the mountains rushed back in to fill the void. We stood there, my wife and I, our breath hitching in the sub-zero air as we stared at the white-capped peaks that now felt like prison walls. Just days ago, the San Juan Mountains had been a playground of pristine white slopes, but now they had transformed into a landscape of lethal rivers of ice. For 4 straight days, the snow had fallen with a relentless ferocity that wiped out every trail and road we knew. By the 5th morning, the ground itself seemed to rebel, as the slopes gave way to massive avalanches that thundered like low-frequency artillery. We knew our primary route to the nearest town was already blocked, buried under tons of unforgiving debris. Our only hope was a long, secondary trail through the back country, but the sky was darkening again with the promise of more snow. With only 2 days of food left in the RV's pantry, the luxury of waiting out the storm had evaporated. We were scrambling to pack the last of our outdoor gear when the second avalanche hit, its roar vibrating through the very soles of our boots. It was immediately after that roar that the scream tore through the valley, a sound so full of agony that it seemed to vibrate the frozen air. There was no doubt in my mind, somewhere in that white wilderness, a human being had just met a brutal end. We stood paralyzed by the realization that we were likely the only ones who had heard that final, desperate cry for help. Despite the danger, I knew we couldn't just drive away without at least trying to find the source of the scream. The snow, however, was a cruel trickster, reflecting and bouncing the sound until the direction of the scream became impossible to pin down. We began to trek toward the nearest ridge, our boots sinking deep into the fresh, unstable powder with every step. A flash of movement in the distance caught my eye, a motorized vehicle cutting through the white haze. We flagged down the local man on the ATV, his face weather-beaten and grim as he listened to our report of the scream. He pulled a radio from his jacket, his voice crackling over the airwaves as he called for a search and rescue team that he knew might arrive too late. There was nothing more we could do. The slopes were too unstable for amateurs, and the threat of more slides loomed over us. We climbed back into the RV and began the treacherous descent, the engine groaning as it fought for traction on the icy secondary road. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening, both of us haunted by the sound we had heard and the person we had left behind. As we reached Glenwood Canyon, we saw that the destruction of the storm had far exceeded our darkest fears. A massive slide had hit the highway just 40 minutes before we arrived, altering the very course of the Colorado River below. Entire sections of the asphalt had simply vanished, swallowed by the raw, indifferent power of the mountain. It felt like the end of days, a landscape rendered unrecognizable by Mother Nature's brutal hand. She is a giving goddess, but Lord, does she know how to take it all away in a single, violent breath. The sheer scale of the slides made me feel insignificant, a tiny speck against the backdrop of ancient, shifting stone. Even as we found safety on the eastern interstate, the scream continued to play on a loop in the back of my mind. It served as a permanent reminder of how helpless we truly are when the wilderness decides to assert its dominance. We were the lucky ones who got away, but the weight of that escape felt heavier than the snow itself. That trip taught me a respect for nature's power that I will carry for the rest of my life. But as we pulled into a rest stop for the night, a new, unsettling feeling began to take root. The parking lot was empty save for a single dark sedan parked in the furthest unlit corner. I tried to focus on the routine of settling in, but every time I looked out the window, that car was still there, its headlights dark. My wife noticed my unease, her eyes darting toward the door every time the wind rattled the RV's frame. A sharp, rhythmic tapping suddenly erupted against the side of the RV, making us both jump. It wasn't the wind, it was the unmistakable sound of metal hitting metal, deliberate and slow. I grabbed my heavy wrench from the tool locker, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I crept toward the door, my hand trembling as it reached for the handle, wondering if the mountains had followed us down. As I threw the door open, the sedan's headlights suddenly roared to life, blinding me with a searing white glare. The blinding headlights of the sedan burned into my retinas as I stood frozen in the RV doorway. I squinted through the glare, trying to see who was behind the wheel of the idling vehicle. But memories of a different trail, the Pacific Crest Trail in 2015, began to flood my mind. It started as an epic 5-day adventure from Echo Lake toward Donner Pass with two of my best friends. On the first night, we camped at Aloha Lake, where the water was so clear it looked like liquid crystal. By day 2, we were climbing Dick's Pass, gasping for air at nearly 10,000 feet above sea level. We traded jokes about the pass's name to distract ourselves from our aching muscles and heavy packs. The third day brought us to Richardson Lake, where we shared a canteen of bourbon under the stars. Day 4 was more stressful as we navigated narrow ridgelines overlooking Lake Tahoe's deep blue expanse. Once we reached Barker Pass, my buddy revealed a small baggie of magic mushrooms he'd hidden in his pack. I had never tried anything like that before, but I eventually agreed to take a small dose. I swallowed the bitter, stinky pieces with gulps of water as my friend had instructed. Soon we were howling at the moon and laughing hysterically along the shore of the lake. I lagged behind the others, mesmerized by the three-dimensional depth of the star-filled sky. When I looked back down, I saw a dark figure standing silently 40 yards away in the shadows. I shouted for the figure to wait, thinking it was one of my friends wandering off. The figure turned and walked away, its neck twisted back toward me in a sickening, impossible angle. My friends yelled for me from the opposite direction, and I convinced myself it was just a hallucination. On our final day, we woke up early to tackle a brutal 19-mile stretch to Donner Pass. We pushed ourselves to an uncomfortable pace, our feet covered in blisters by the afternoon. Reaching Donner Pass felt like a monumental victory after the grueling physical toll of the day. We set up our final camp and sat around the fire, reminiscing about our decade-long friendship. Suddenly, the sound of rhythmic footsteps approaching through the dry leaves made us fall silent. A man stepped into our firelight, looking far more disheveled than any hiker we'd met. His lower jaw was partially missing, making one side of his face look sunken and hollow. He walked with a pronounced limp, his movements jerky as he asked if he could join us. His eyes were small and as black as coal dust, reflecting the orange flames in a predatory way. He claimed he had lived in these hills with his family for a long, long time. He asked if we were armed, looking around our camp as if searching for hidden rifles. The man then offered to tell us a true story about 3 dumbass city boys on the trail. He described our exact movements, mentioning the howling and screaming we did the night before. I realized then that the hallucination I saw in the meadow had been this man following us. He mocked us for being innocent as babes and oblivious to the dangers of the wilderness. When one of my friends told him to move along, the man just laughed a low, chilling sound. He suggested that attacking him would be a mistake, as his cousins were waiting in the darkness. We sat in paralyzed silence as he stood up, bid us farewell, and limped back into the trees. As he vanished, we heard not just his footsteps, but the sound of dozens of others moving in the brush. We abandoned our camp and walked for miles in the dark until we felt somewhat safe. The memory of those black, beady eyes watching us from the firelight never truly left me. Back in the present, a heavy thump hit the roof of my RV, and the headlights outside suddenly cut to black. I jerked awake as the heavy thump on the RV roof echoed through the small cabin. The sudden loss of the exterior headlights plunged the surrounding forest into an impenetrable void. This moment of terror reminded me of a much earlier winter, back when I was just a boy camping with my father in Alabama. We had set up our camp late in the afternoon, seeking the quiet solitude that only the cold months provide. By the time the night had fully settled, the woods around us had fallen into a heavy, unnatural silence. The usual rustling of leaves was completely muffled by the frost, making every tiny sound feel amplified. We were just about to crawl into our sleeping bags when a low, bone-chilling rasping drifted through the trees. My dad looked at me with a tight expression, trying to convince us both it was just the wind. But then the sound returned, louder and more unmistakable, a long, drawn-out groan of pure agony. A third groan followed, so eerie and hollow that it sent a violent shiver down my spine. My father grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and signaled for me to stay close behind him. I grabbed a thick fallen branch, holding it like a club as I followed him into the frost. The biting winter air stung our faces as we moved deeper into the dark, following the intermittent cries. Eventually, the beam of light landed on a human figure sprawled awkwardly on a frozen hillside. She was lying with her head facing downhill and her feet uphill, a position that looked both uncomfortable and dangerous. Her body was completely still, except for the occasional weak moan that escaped her blue-tinged lips. I felt a profound sense of unease as the forest seemed to hold its breath around this dying stranger. My dad knelt beside her, checking for a pulse and shining the light to assess her condition. Her eyes were glazed over and unfocused, darting around without truly seeing us. Her clothes were soaked through with melting frost and smelled strongly of stale alcohol. When she tried to speak, the words were slurred and made almost no sense to my young ears. We slowly pieced together her tragic story from the fragments of her delirious speech. She had been camping with her boyfriend nearby when a violent argument broke out between them. He had driven off in a rage, leaving her completely stranded in the middle of the wilderness. In her drunken state, she had seen the distant, dying glow of our campfire and tried to reach us. She had intended to bring us the rest of her firewood as a peace offering, but she had fallen in the dark. Too weak and intoxicated to stand back up, she had simply lain there as the hypothermia set in. Those groans we heard were her final, desperate attempts to call for help before her voice failed. My father hoisted her up, bracing her weight against his shoulder as we began the trek back to her site. I carried the flashlight, leading the way through the labyrinth of frozen pines. We found her abandoned campsite, a scene of chaotic domesticity turned into a frozen nightmare. My dad settled her into her own sleeping bag, piling on every dry blanket we could find. Her breathing remained shallow, and I wondered if she would even survive until morning. My father told her to stay put and wait for her boyfriend to return, though his tone suggested he doubted the man would come back. We returned to our own camp in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing down on both of us. I couldn't shake the image of her lying there, a discarded life nearly snuffed out by the cold and human cruelty. To this day, I wonder if that boyfriend ever returned or if she had to find her own way out of those woods. That memory had stayed with me, a reminder of how quickly the wilderness can become a tomb. Suddenly, the RV rocked violently, pulling me back from the past to the terrifying present. Through the back window, I saw multiple flashlight beams dancing in the trees surrounding the vehicle. I realized then that the thump on the roof wasn't a falling branch, but someone climbing onto the vehicle. I fumbled for the ignition, but the engine only gave a hollow metallic click. The side door handle began to rattle with a rhythmic, mechanical persistence. A muffled voice from just outside the glass whispered my name, though I had told no one where I was going. The glass suddenly shattered inward as a heavy object smashed through the frame. The jagged shards of the window lay scattered across the cold floor like diamonds in the moonlight. We huddled together in the corner of the tent, the memory of that sudden crash still ringing in our ears. Being only 16 and 17 years old, the vastness of the Alabama woods felt more like a cage than a playground. The evening had started peacefully enough with the crackle of a small fire and the scent of charred hot dogs. Suddenly, a man emerged from the shadows of the tree line carrying a fishing pole over his shoulder. He asked, with a forced politeness, if he could cut through our camp to reach the main road. We gave him a hesitant nod, but instead of leaving, he rooted himself at the edge of our circle. His eyes darted between our two tents and our small pile of supplies as he began to ask questions. He wanted to know exactly how old we were and where our parents were staying. In our youthful naivety, we answered his questions, providing the very details that made us targets. He asked how many nights we planned to stay alone in this specific spot. When he finally walked away toward the canyon, we both let out a breath we hadn't realized we were holding. But the silence of the woods didn't last, as the crunch of boots on frost returned 2 hours later. This time, the first man wasn't alone. He had returned with a companion of similar age. They didn't have fishing poles anymore, and their presence felt like an intentional intrusion. They repeated the same questions, as if cross-referencing our earlier answers for any lies. The first man began to wander through our site, nudging our backpacks with the toe of his boot. He even poked at the fabric of our tents, checking to see if anyone else was hiding inside. After a few minutes of agonizing tension, they turned and headed up the canyon, disappearing into the dark. We sat in a deafening silence, the roar of the nearby river suddenly sounding like a warning. My friend whispered that the water was so loud it would drown out the sound of anyone approaching. We realized with a jolt that we had never seen them head back down the canyon toward the road. They were still out there, somewhere in the blackness above our camp, watching and waiting. Without a word, we both knew we couldn't spend another second in that vulnerable spot. We abandoned our heavy stove and half-empty water jugs, focusing only on what we could carry as we ran. Every snapping twig behind us felt like a hand reaching out to grab our shoulders. Our flashlights cut through the mist, revealing phantom shapes that turned out to be only trees. We didn't stop until we reached the gravel road where my old car was parked in the distance. The engine roared to life, a mechanical growl that finally drowned out the sound of the woods. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of two figures standing by the edge of the road in the rearview mirror. We never looked back, but the feeling of being hunted stayed with us for years. I realized later that those men had spent hours calculating our vulnerability before deciding to strike. The wilderness is a place of beauty, but it also provides a perfect veil for the darkest of intentions. Those men weren't looking for fish, they were looking for an opportunity that we almost gave them. But even as we fled, another shadow was growing in a different part of the Montana wild. A man named Dustin was preparing for his own solo journey, unaware of the tragedy that awaited him. He headed toward Moose Creek, a place known for its serenity and its isolation. Little did he know a friendly stranger was already watching from the brush. The invitation for a simple beer would soon turn into a fight for survival that would haunt the valley forever. As the campfire in Montana flickers out, the true nightmare is only just beginning. The dense forests of Moose Creek, Montana, held a silence that was far from peaceful in October of 2024. Dustin Mitchell Comey, a 35-year-old father and contractor, had ventured into these woods for a solo camping trip. He was an experienced outdoorsman who often sought the solace of the Big Sky wilderness to recharge. Dustin had arranged to meet a friend on October 12th to finish the final leg of the trip together. When Dustin failed to appear at the designated meeting spot, his friend began to feel a gnawing sense of dread. The friend hiked toward Dustin's last known campsite, calling out his name into the freezing air. Upon reaching the clearing, the friend discovered a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dustin was found inside his tent, his body brutally mangled and devoid of life. The initial report suggested a grizzly bear attack, a common hazard in the Montana backcountry. However, when the Gallatin County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found no bear tracks or signs of animal scavenging. An autopsy soon confirmed the darkest of suspicions. Dustin Comey had been the victim of a homicide. He had suffered multiple chop wounds and severe blunt force trauma to the head. A manhunt began as investigators desperately searched for a motive and a killer in the vast wilderness. Detectives combed through trail camera footage and interviewed everyone who had been in the Moose Creek area. On October 30th, a breakthrough occurred when a man already in custody on unrelated charges began to talk. The suspect was identified as Darren Christopher Abbey, and his confession was chillingly matter-of-fact. Abbey claimed he had encountered Dustin by chance and that the young father had been incredibly kind to him. Despite the warm welcome, Abbey had waited for Dustin to turn his back before launching a frenzied attack. He used a piece of wood, a screwdriver, and eventually an axe to end Dustin's life. After the murder, Abbey stole a cooler, a shotgun, and a revolver from the site to hide his tracks. The motive for such a senseless and unprovoked act of violence remains a mystery to this day. Dustin left behind a grieving family, including a young daughter who would grow up without her father. A memorial was held at Headwaters State Park, where hundreds gathered to honor his generous spirit. The tragedy served as a grim reminder that even in the most serene settings, darkness can lurk. The community of Big Sky stood together, refusing to let fear dictate their love for the outdoors. As the trial of Darren Abbey progressed, the focus remained on securing justice for a man who died for his kindness. Dustin's legacy lived on through the stories told by those who knew his laughter and his strength. In the end, the light of his memory proved far more enduring than the shadow of the man who took him. We must always respect the wild, but we must also remain vigilant of the human element within it. The case of the Moose Creek tragedy closed a dark chapter in the history of the San Juan Mountains. It reminded every hiker and camper to cherish every moment and never take safety for granted. The snow continues to fall in Moose Creek, covering the scars of the past in a blanket of white. Justice was served, and the monster of Moose Creek was hidden away from the world he terrorized. Dustin's family found a small measure of peace in knowing that no one else would suffer at Abbey's hands. His name is now a symbol of the kindness that still exists, even in the harshest environments. This final story concludes our journey through the deadly silence of the winter wild. We have seen the power of nature and the unpredictability of the human spirit. May these tales serve as a guide for your own adventures, keeping you safe and aware. treasure the beauty of the frost, but always listen to the whispers of the wind. For in the heart of winter, the greatest survival tool is a vigilant and grateful heart.